Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. In today's episode, I'm going to look at what we might deem a sister theory of self-determination theory, or just an alternative view on how people might regulate their behaviour. And what I'm meaning to say is we're going to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This, just to sort of like, I suppose, from the off, this is quite clearly something that's been around for a long time, literally the 1940s, I think, when this was initially coined. And there has been a lot of evidence since, perhaps, that's been contradictory to this sort of theory, or in a lot of different ways, and we will touch on that. And this isn't about trying to sort of you know, convince you by the end of the episode that, you know what the podcast has been speaking about most of the time in self-determination theory, forget about that. Maslow's in. It's definitely not that. But I think there's some utility still in some of the core points of this alternative model for understanding human needs that I think has a real practical relevance to coaches, and might just help unlock another layer of sense making when perhaps we come up against problems with athletes, or in plateaus perhaps in their development from a motivational standpoint, or just in terms of how we proactively try and plan our environment in such a way that seems to meet athletes at where they're at and the stage of development they're at. So we're going to touch on a lot about that today. I mean, I'm going to kind of compare the two sort of ways of viewing what is a this is different in this way and that. I will do that, but actually these are more alike than different. And here's a way of sort of synergizing these sort of different viewpoints and or perspectives on motivation in a way that I think gets the most out of them both. You know, in a way that we can sort of take forward and be effective with. So that's the plan today. Well, I've got you. Please, if you're this is a first time listener, well, welcome to the podcast. Please subscribe. Give it a listen if you think it's about pants, then that's absolutely fine as well. But please subscribe if you do like it, and also you can rate it 5 stars ideally. Again, it helps the visibility of the show. And share it with other coaches. I would love to do that. And actually, I will be sharing my views twofold when if, in the next month or so at the coaching symposium ran at Stirling University, which is a yearly event. I'm so excited to be delivering, I think now 2 workshops and just repeating the workshops because we've got quite a big sign up already, looking at information fallacy and coach behaviour. So that's in the 18th of November. It's completely free. I've been a long time attendee at this event, so I'm really sort of pumped and psyched to actually get to stand out there and give a bit of a chat myself about some of the things that I'm passionate about that you'll hear a lot about already in the podcast. But I can only encourage you, even if you're not coming to see me, please go along, check out the site. I'll put the link in the show notes. There's a lot of different speakers, fortunately not only from the world of academia, and I think a lot of the delegates are also very reflective of just actually coaches on the ground, coach developers on the ground, and it really does make for really interesting conversations and dialogue from presenter to the audience and stuff like that. So just wanted to kind of plug that there. Please come along, and come and chat to me as well, which would be excellent. So, and again, for that, and that goes, I think I said that already, but if you are a new listener, great, you've got all that stuff that you can plug it in. If you are a continued listener, welcome back. And again, just make sure that you are also subscribed if you haven't already. Just please do that. It'd be absolutely brilliant. Really helps with the growth of the show. Particularly nowadays, now that I'm a bit cold now on social media, I'm not really that active at all anymore. So it's a wee bit more analog, my methods for marketing the podcast. So really word of mouth is paramount here, and the best that you can do is more than what I could do and my own, I believe. So yeah, enough small talk. That's out of the way. So let's cover the topic at hand then. Okay. So I'm going to start, I think, by talking about well, as a brief recap, I suppose, in self-determination theory. If you think about what we in the modern age deal with most, is it's the view that athletes have these sort of universal basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness that build on top of one another, that are developed simultaneously, and that are vital for longer term motivation if fulfilled, and counter to that can be very detrimental, could longer term motivation and all the other sort of positive outcomes that come out of the quality of one's motivation, in terms of their persistence, their effort, the attainment within a sporting context in the way that coaches would be trying to target things. So we kind of we understand that, and again, autonomy meaning the process of sort of feeling like you're in control of your behaviour, like what you're doing is, is helping you build towards a sort of more and more integrated version of yourself. So things are very much in balance with what you want to do, what you are doing. Competence, feeling like you can effectively engage with your environment, feeling like you have a degree of competence, and relatedness, that sort of feeling of belonging, that sort of as social creatures, feeling accepted, feeling that you can trust your environment and having that sort of sense of security and safety within the space that you're in terms of in relation to other people. So these things kind of interact with each other, and it's across the years through a lot of testing and investigation, it certainly became quite a widely held consensus that it's one of, if not the most most modern take on how people regulate their behavior across time, and how those different regulations of behavior are susceptible to the messaging of the external environment, which can compound the feelings of satisfaction or compound the feelings of frustration or neglect. And that coaches have, importantly, the capacity to alter those internal states in such a way that we are pushing athletes further and further towards something that is more internalized or more self-determined, and hopefully further and further away, or at least wherever there is a practical utility to move away from something that is more extrinsic. Again, the practical utilities and the nuance of that, we cover that in different episodes. And for example, you can go look back where I've actually spoke about the times where coaches might actually utilize extrinsic, i.e. external motivators for different reasons, and because people are complicated, academic theory can only go so far. There is a lot about what you actually do in the moment, and being pragmatic, I think, and understanding where certain solutions meet certain problems in the right way at the right time is fundamental to being an effective coach. And that's sort of like why I've sort of my pragmatist viewpoint is probably what what created my curiosity to sort of understand, not opposing, but just slightly alternative viewpoints on motivation. And that's sort of where I then stepped into kind of thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what is hierarchy of needs and the way that Maslow sort of thinks about this? So this was way back in the 1940s. Maslow, it was a psychologist, and they put forward a view of motivation that is hierarchical, is progressive, and it came out of, and it wasn't necessarily sport specific. It was more, again, the same way self-determination theory wasn't necessarily conceived within sport. It was mainstream psychology and understanding people. I think Maslow actually, it was looking at like the high achievers and sort of trying to reverse engineer things from there to say, well, if you are an Albert Einstein, how do you when you're sitting on that cloud, that self-actualization stage, and I'm jumping a little bit here, I'll come back, but what maybe has to be underneath that in order to unlock your capacity and your interest in that next level of existence and performance and stuff like that. So it's very much built on a sort of understanding of how people develop, and what people need at a really fundamental level in order to then gradually over time go on to achieve or want other certain needs that we sort of unlock needs and unlock the next level of needs after completing the level before, in some sense. A wee bit of a quick overview of the 5 levels. When we're talking about the very foundation, it's like a pyramid. So you need to think of it as a pyramid. And if you Google it, you'll see that. Do that to follow along if you're, just listening, or you have capacity to do that on your phone, or wherever you're listening to this on, tablet or whatever. The base of the pyramid is the sort of idea of the physiological needs that someone might have. Now, that's quite obvious in the sense that it's actually talking about things like, we need food, we need water, we need warmth, we need rest. Okay, the most basic of things. It's about sustenance. We then, one above that, once those needs are sort of met in some sense, we need the safety needs that we have, and as far as our security, our safety, those sorts of things. And then again, once those needs are met, then it becomes about belongingness and sort of the need for to be feel loved and to love others, I suppose, as well, and to form interrelationships with people as sort of social creatures, to have friendship groups, to become part of a group. And then again, once we're part of that group, then it becomes a little bit about our own self-esteem and gaining sort of a sense of prestige, feelings of accomplishment, competency, those sorts of things. And then once all those needs are met, then it's the view that then someone then starts to really, at the more sort of creative, advanced level of being, it starts to look towards self-actualization, which is really about sort of try to achieve one's sort of fullest potential, engaging in creative activities, having real deep meaning in what they do, that sort of idea. We can sort of apply each of those sort of hierarchical needs in the different stages to what kind of an athlete might go through. And again, just for the purpose of sort of thought exercise, maybe what an athlete might go through in their sort of long-term athlete development journey. So if you think about sort of the young athletes, I'm only explaining this so that it just helps us maybe understand it for the time being. It's not to say that you can also have senior athletes who are at the foundational phase of this based on circumstances. It's maybe actually one of the more critiques probably of the model in itself, which I can come back to later on. But let's just accept some of these things for now. So with young athletes, there's the idea of sort of physiological and the safety levels being met together insofar as thinking about nutrition, having sort of stable support, not being injured, those sorts of things, because they can't really go anywhere if they aren't, feel properly, if they aren't functioning properly, sport being a physical thing, if they don't have sort of some stable stability of their environment, continuity in terms of where they're at, that sort of thing. So they're fairly fundamental modes of being. And then you might find, and again, let's just for the purpose of things here, like as they maybe get older, or maybe certainly at the very least, then as their needs are covered, then the next thing that becomes important that is allowed to be a priority at that point, but that they maybe don't import. It's not that they weren't important to begin with, but it's just maybe if you think about that, we weren't able to really tap into it fully because if these other needs weren't met, then it's not a priority. And it's sort of like trying to run a car without wheels. That makes sense. So then it's like, at the sort of belonging stage, and it becomes about sort of the team identity, sort of peer acceptance, the social relationships can become really vital, and we can be more open to be able to think about making friends, having intimate relationships with our teammates, with the coaches, those sorts of things. And then what you might see is if we have those things covered, we've got athletes who are good nutrition, they've got a stable environment, they're not injured, they've got friendship groups. From there, then it's that idea that, well, once these things are covered, then they feel more of a need then to actually develop sort of a sense of competence. They want to achieve things, they want to sort of have that feeling of accomplishments. And then once they can do that, then they're in a position where they aren't needing to worry so much about all these things that came before. And then we might be able to see an athlete's fullest expression of themselves in terms of their striving at that stage to really try and be, achieve their full potential. And they might start to then think about legacy and the purpose of what they're doing. And the thoughts become much deeper as a result. So it's trying to really get you to think about Maslow's pyramid. It's almost trying to remind us that athletes, they don't just need motivation, they actually need the right conditions in order to climb through the stages of regulation in some way. Now, maybe at this stage, it might be the best point to maybe discuss then some of the criticisms of this way of viewing things from more of an academic lens, and then we can maybe think about, well, how much it matters outside of that, if it's useful as a tool of thought. There is a lot of stuff that's sort of thought about around this with sort of the cultural and contextual limitations of the module. So people might say that it's maybe overly simplistic, that it sort of thinks that, you just need to add things one at a time. People are complicated, obviously, and whenever you try and fit people into boxes, it innately goes wrong. Also, there's probably some sort of slant towards a more westernized, sort of individualistic value structure within that. In terms of like it almost as you move up the ladder, you become not more self-centered, but you are thinking more about yourselves. And the thing is that different cultures obviously would prioritize needs differently, and therefore that sort of linear progression within a hierarchy might not always apply universally, and that's always been something that's been said. Modern psychology, you'll recognise as well, is that it was like self-determination theory, is that when we look across the spectrum of motivation types, the different behaviour regulators, it's not seen as developmental in the sense that one has to move through it. It's actually sort of circumstantial in a lot of respects. And you can move across that spectrum at will based on circumstance, based on environmental conditions, and that could be a drastic change or it might be an overtime change. So it's just that, come back to the idea of not trying to put people into boxes. People's journeys, experiences are all very different and complicated, and it's sort of like, I think that was why self-determination theory always maybe caught on in a way that was quite helpful for understanding that complexity. There is also then the sort of the idea of this sort of actual level of empirical support. Maslow's theory has got acceptance insofar as a working model of where it can be useful, but there hasn't actually been a whole lot of empirical evidence supporting the hierarchy of needs. It's a wee bit limited. So the thing is, my belief here and is that, we don't necessarily, they are still relevant, but that it's clear that they maybe don't necessarily need to be filled in a specific order. And what I'm want to try and do now is to think, actually, how can we modernize it in such a way that it can be viewed more as a flexible framework rather than this really sort of rigid, here is the pyramid, this is the base structure, work on this first with athletes, and then do this, and then do that. Let's be open-minded with how this can be used, but I think the best way to be open-minded with how the Maslow's hierarchy needs to be used and then how it can still be deemed to have a relevancy still in the modern age is by seeing it as a flexible framework that can be used in collaboration with a more self-determined view on things. And I'm going to sort of try and help us understand the ways that we can discuss this, and importantly, the ways that I think actually what a coach who thinks a lot about motivational quality and about fulfilling the three basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence, relatedness, how I think if they get stuck, how they can actually dip into Maslow's hierarchy to think about things, if momentarily in a more rigid manner, at the least, in order to then figure out whether they maybe went wrong or whether they maybe need to think about more foundational conditions that have to be fulfilled in order to actually serve as a sort of firm base point on which a more needs supportive, in the modern sense, a coaching approach can actually be effective. So, and that's the way I want us to think about the things. Okay, so let's sort of compare the two a little bit more closely now. So, I know I've already kind of started doing that, but I think just to kind of hit on a couple of points here. Maslow's, in terms of hierarchy versus the universality of basic psychological needs and self-determination theory, Maslow's is sort of a bit like you have to survive before you can thrive. And truthfully, like, that is completely legitimate. Like, completely legitimate. It's like, and again, as a coach, how we can reflect on that is really, really important. But we'll come to that. So versus self-determination theory, it's like the needs are universal and simultaneous. All three are always essential. And the way that we can think about this as we move towards it, then, if I think about the survive first and before you can thrive, it doesn't matter in a lot of ways as a coach about how much I'm trying to support athletes' autonomy, confidence, relatedness. If I'm not, and I need to be careful as I say this, 'cause I know that sometimes I can get caught in the specifics here, but just go with it a little bit with me. You get it. But if my athletes, aren't being looked after, if it properly physically, maybe they're being overtrained, and it comes into some of the ethical conundrums of the way coaches maybe approach the wider environment. But at the foundational level, if athletes maybe haven't got the correct health, and that might not just be physical health, by the way, it could be also thinking about their mental health. And maybe they haven't got, maybe they're injured. A lot of the stuff that we try and work with them on is going to have diminished return. Now, you can obviously, of course, like, you can work with injured athletes in a psychologically supportive way. But what I mean to say is, if we're aiming towards how we can get the most out of them, make athletes better, and all these sorts of things. Before, I think we try and think about, creating environmental conditions that make them feel good and competent and make them feel like a sense of belonging and these sorts of things. At a very foundational level, we need to make sure that they've got a really good base point of mental and physical health, and that we're really checking in on their needs before we then start to kind of enhance them through caring for the needs of, autonomy, competence. So I know it's a wee bit like, is it what comes first, the chicken or the egg here? But that is the kind of the viewpoint of how I can connect this a little bit. But again, if we flip it, okay, so with the universal and simultaneous element of three basic psychological needs and self-determination theory, we wouldn't believe that you have to, uh, we wouldn't believe that you can only reach the point of, to self-actualization is at the very top of Maslow's pyramid, could be really termed as autonomy from a self-determination theory hat. And it wouldn't be that you have to wait until all these needs are met before you try to impact autonomy, because autonomy is universally felt, but also autonomy builds on competence and relatedness, which is seen further down in the pyramid. By giving athletes input and a sense of ownership, you're communicating confidence in their ability to perform well, and to have that ownership in such a way. You're also, by the fact of being quite interpersonally involved and giving them that involvement, you're communicating, a sense of connectedness, where you're enhancing the sense of connectedness with the athlete. At the flip side, however, relatedness, and this is where I do believe, this is where, again, I'm arguing for it against Maslow for a moment there, but then I'm also going to give him his due, because one of the things that's coming out more and more nowadays is how underappreciated relatedness and competence were behind autonomy in a lot of ways. And I think Maslow's theory actually does a good job of flipping things in an order that creates a better balance. And I think as coaches, if we think about this and take this forward, it can make us more balanced in the way that we appreciate each of the three needs and strategies that are there to help them. So relatedness, if you don't trust your environment, and this sort of maybe is how you then start to see Maslow coming into this viewpoint. If you don't trust your environment and you don't think there's a certain degree of structure and consistency in the environment and it's not mentally safe for you, how are you going to then be inclined or feel enabled and empowered to then, one, to engage with the instructions as a coach, two, to actually, form enough of a relationship that you then can actually uh, bring in your own viewpoints. So, like, this is what I mean. I've always said in the past, and if you look at some of the episodes with like Sophia Duet or Colin Cronin, like caring coaching is so important because caring coaching unlocks the capacity for coaches to help athletes be better by really streamlining the communication stream that can happen in terms of instruction and stuff like that and feedback that you can give, but also then opening up the door for autonomy. So it's interesting then if you connect that back to Maslow's sort of pyramid that does put the idea of safety, the sort of safety needs and the sort of belonging needs as being really paramount before you can unlock um, a space where maybe the need for competence can be felt even doubly, then there's a wee bit of truth to that somewhat. And this is what I mean. It's not like if I put the cat out of the bag, it's probably obvious I'm intimating this, but clearly we can think about prioritizing certain needs while simultaneously trying to fulfill all in terms of how we can connect the three basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence, relatedness with a sort of hierarchical structure and a progressive mindset that is explained or suggested and demonstrated through a theory like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, or a model, if you don't want to necessarily deem it as technically a theory. So there's these sort of things are happening, and that's sort of like the coaching implications of that then. When we compare the fulfillment of needs that Maslow thinks about with motivational quality that self-determination thinks about, it's almost like Maslow's lens is helpful for identifying why motivation might be blocked. Because maybe a lower need hasn't been met well enough. And we sometimes have come up against that with athletes, I feel. But then what else STD helps you then do is refine how to reignite it then if there is an issue. So Maslow might be helping you kind of meet athletes where they're at. And then self-determination theory, after that sort of needs assessment has been done, might help you then figure out the right way to actually interact with them and get them to where they need to go. And that's a nice way of sort of thinking about this. Then there's sort of the other sort of way of the angle in here is around sort of growth versus more of a performance focus, with Maslow sort of emphasizing more of a personal growth and sort of self-actualization way of seeing things. Well, what self-determination theory also emphasizes is what's sustainable motivation and sort of what's more about psychological well-being. And it's not to say that Maslow isn't necessarily thinking about that, but it does a lot of the empirical exploration of self-determination theory has always been around what actually is the connection between psychological needs being met and alongside motivation and indicators of motivation that come out of that, but actually like indicators of health and well-being. So there's a lot of that because we no longer term athletes that feel controlled in their motivation. They can develop anxiety, they can develop rebellious behaviour, it can go further than that, it can dropout propensity can increase, depression, even in sort of extreme cases, these sorts of things, and all other sort of different affective states that can come out of that. So again, it's like Maslow's is thinking a lot about how we can continue to grow and be bigger, but again, self-determination phase, well, how do you do that? It's like, what's the means to the end within that? So again, I think that's complementary. I don't think that necessarily cancels each other out if we approach it in a more nuanced way that we're trying to do now. And then what I think what coaches can do, however, is they can use Maslow's framework as well. This is the other thing, not however, as well. They can actually use Maslow's framework to interpret the idea of long-term athlete development. Well, obviously, sort of SDT offers that more sort of daily tools that help sustain motivation. So if you think about an academy journey or a youth development journey, are we saying that players, and again, this is sometimes about even if we can accept that needs are universally felt by all people, all ages and stages in some degree, at a conscious level, or at least at the level of understanding that people need to be trained to be autonomous. People need to be trained to be, able to take input and stuff like that. There is clearly a stepping stone of how we can at least put that into the athlete. And psychosocial training, in a way, I think is best where we periodise to some degree, at least in terms of understanding the processes and the windows of opportunity that exist, where perhaps it's more athletes are more agreeable to that sort of plan, and the coaching can be more set up in a way that helps work with athletes where they're at. If you think about young kids, who are just at the start of their sort of journey, it's obvious that we need to sort of think about making them feel like they belong, make them care about them as a kid, make them feel good. And then maybe over time, as they get better at the sport, it makes sense in some way to then invite them to have more ownership within that at that sort of practical level. To then maybe, and it almost goes to like goal setting. Like I can't expect a 9-year-old to go to set goals further than a month. When they're 18 or 19, or they need that. They absolutely need to have that sense of input in things, or they might move away. And again, it's not to say that the 8 and 9-year-old can't still be encouraged to do those things early on, and it's not important to do that and give them that sense of it. But in terms of where we know we can get the most success earlier in their journey, it might be more with really honing in on their sense of competence and their sense of relatedness. So it's kind of like working with the athlete and moving with them as they evolve. And you can think about how in a long-term athlete development journey, it has to be more about, maybe from the technical skill development element to then actually try to develop the strategic thought more as you go. I know people that will say you should develop both things at once. I'm not saying you shouldn't either, but I just think for the purpose of thinking, if you look at what your if you're in a youth academy in any sport, whatever, if you look at the things that are the priorities at the different milestones of your athlete, you probably will see some alignment with a sort of Maslow view on things. And if you aren't, I would then just actually be curious, how effective is that overall model? What are the athletes like at the top stages who we might perceive to be at the self-actualisation point? If they're not quite there, or you maybe have athletes that are dropping out, has there been certain things that have been undermining your good efforts to try and get athletes to somewhere? And do we need to maybe think about some of the more foundational needs that people might have wider than sport, and the way that there is people and the things, but then bringing that sort of foundational viewpoint into sport, and sort of like, as I say, changing it from physiological needs about water and warmth to being about, being injured and not being injured, and having good sort of mental health. And so these sorts of things. So it's just something to keep in mind. I want to sort of, if we can, and as we sort of move towards the end of this conversation with it, you're obviously clear at this stage that I'm not asking you to choose between one. And this is what I mean. I don't think it's not that Maslow's has to be dismissed. What I want us to do is use them both dynamically. Okay, so Maslow to help us understand perhaps where we need to prioritize needs, and then self-determination theory to help us understand how we can actually enact them in our everyday behaviour. So Maslow gives a compass of ways in some in terms of how we might periodize across time the layers that we might accentuate more than others, not to replace them. And this is how we merge these things, not to not to exclusively focus on, rather, but to think about what the emphasis could be. And it might be a problem solving solution, or you might be in a different place, and then you understand, as I say, because cultural relevance is king here. Even in the culture you're at, maybe it's a more collectivist culture, or it's the sport you're in has its own sort of subculture, and maybe it sort of flips Maslow's hierarchy in its head a little bit, or there's certain things that it's removing. But have you thought about building your own version of these sort of hierarchical needs as a thought exercise to guide your long-term athlete development plan in a way, and then think about how self-determination theory can help you in the lower order level of that plan to really keep them there first and foremost, and to ensure that we're actually get a means of bringing about the sense of belonging that we know people need, to bring about the esteem needs that people have, regardless of if it's the stage in which we would be expected to believe that they unlock that requirement, or if it's something, as we say, that we do sort of all the time, and pay attention to all the time. So it's just a roadmap. As I say, Maslow gives us a roadmap of needs, and self-determination theories gives us that sort of engine of motivation that helps propel people through it. So I think that actually together they do help coaches meet athletes where they're at, and helps them guide them to where they could become. So possible takeaways from this, I know I've started on it already, but just does make sure I could touch on other points of what I've touched on here. Diagnose before you motivate, I think is quite important. Kind of identify maybe what needs are unmet or what needs are more unmet than others? And can you see a relationship between those things and perhaps what you're seeing designed for autonomy? So you should still, I think, appreciate, even if Maslow's got that sort of self-actualisation, which is sort of interchangeable with the idea of autonomy at the top, you need to scaffold that in a way, perhaps, with athletes, because maybe as they are younger, if we think about it in the most classic sense of it, they need to be trained to be autonomous, but nonetheless, they need, even if they aren't great at it, they still require it. But again, so you might still build a bit of an importance in making it so it's apparent somewhere. Um, Regardless of what stage they're at, even in your own hierarchy or in your own sort of spectrum, or whatever way you want to look at the athlete development journey, across the sort of meso to, the everyday at the micro level, and adapt to the developmental stage. If younger athletes need more security, then great. Think about that, considering that. If mature athletes need more self-direction, it's okay to lean in on that and maybe appreciate that if maybe you're being too controlling when working with an older group. And then just sort of toggle between these things all the time, because always, as I say, coaching is a science, but it's also an art, and it leads me more to think of it as a philosophy. I always think like we need to toggle between sort of more foundational care, and I think Maslow's pyramid is brilliant for really making that make sense in a way that you can just pick up and kind of use in your own sort of tailored way and meeting your environment. But with that sort of foundational care, it's then about toggling between that and the more sort of the psychological empowerment that's also, obviously very important, and we know to be very much true in the way that the empirical evidence is talking to us about the strength of that argument. So if you're coaching this week, just ask yourself, like, what needs are most alive in your environment or lacking the most in your athletes right now? And are you meeting them in a way that truly fulfills their motivation from within? So just incorporate Maslow's hierarchy of needs within your needs assessment of your own coaching, I believe. So I hope that's been useful. I just do think it's a really interesting sort of time capsule, if you will, of thought. And I think it's still apparent. If it's not apparent and it's not the most widely researched model anymore in the literature, which it isn't, but it's still clearly in people's minds and does get discussed still in sort of mainstream psychology as a useful tool, as a useful imperfect tool. I'm starting to believe more and more that the more imperfect tools are often where coaching is, because coaching an imperfect exercise. And I think the tension of that means that it gives me more reason to think about where it can still be utilised and less about what's wrong with it and how we need to just completely disband it. I don't think that's the right thing to do. So like everything, people are complicated, motivation is complicated, make up your own mind on it. I hope that has been useful. Go and check it out as you learn about self-determination theory through this podcast, and we'll see where we get to. So hopefully you enjoyed that, guys, and I will see you next time.